I misspoke a few times in this next clip, so there's going to be some annotations as well.
So this is the weights of AlexNet, which is a neural network. And so when people talk about the black box of neural networks, this is what they are talking about. So you can see that there's a few different kind of flat layers, and these are the layers of the neural network. So it looks like it starts out pretty small, and then it gets larger, and then there's these really big layers in the middle, and then it starts getting a little bit thinner again as you go back, and then there's the last one's a little bit smaller than the first one. So these are kind of separated into two different types. There's the convolutional layers at the start, and then there's the fully connected layers at the back. So the convolutional layers are made up of a bunch of these little boxes, and a huge number of these little boxes, and these boxes are separated. So you can see that they are distinct boxes, but then these fully connected layers are just one kind of continuous thing. So they are just a single image. And so I wanted to first walk through just kind of the basics setup of AlexNet, and then we'll look at some of the layers in a little bit more detail. So starting off with, you come into the network here, and you have an input layer, and then some convolutional layers, and some ReLU layers, which are kind of like linear functions. You have some max pooling, so that's making larger images into smaller images. Convolutional layers, as we go through, there's more convolutional layers, and then we have a flattening step. So before the flattening step, there's a lot of structure that's getting passed through. Afterwards, it's kind of just a single array of numbers. Then we have this fully connected step, and fully connected step, fully connected step, and then we output to one of 1,000 classes. So zooming back out, when we're talking about layers, these are basically the intermediary math steps. So if you think about like a set of additions, these are going to be the additions. And so we aren't actually including the intermediary steps in this visualization. So that's something to keep in mind. So going over it into a little bit more detail, this first step has these kind of 3 sets of images that are across, and then you can see that like across there's more sets. And so the 3 sets in, the 3 sets in, those are all going to be the colors. So there's the RGB, and so you can see that it kind of creates these filters that look very similar to kind of edge detection filters or other ones. And there's some that actually just pick out particular colors. So one like over here, you can see that one color it suppresses, and then I think the B value it kind of looks for. So it's looking for certain colors in the center. So maybe this one, because it has a lot of, I think that's the RGB, so it's looking for blue in the middle. So maybe it's looking for something that's like more of a water-like image. And these are all trained. And then if you notice, so one way of looking at this is that the input comes in this way, and then the output falls downwards, so, or falls upwards. So because, yeah, you can see that there is the width of this is actually going to be related to the height of the next column, so, or the next image. And so the number that we see on the height here is related to the width of this row, and then the width of this row is going to be related to the height of the next row, and that kind of continues throughout. So if you see some sort of large width here, it'll be a large width in the next row. And so to start off with, we're using images filters that are pretty big, 11 by 11. The next one is going to be 5 by 5. And so basically when you're looking at the height, a lot of times there's either like symmetry up and down or symmetry across. And so symmetry up and down, all of that is going to the output. So it'll be looking for certain things and structuring the output in certain ways. But as you can see, there's kind of certain symmetries up and down and certain symmetries across. And so there is quite a bit of information you can get from the second layer too, where there's quite a bit of things that look like there's quite a few images that look very similar to one another. And so that shows that there's some level of structure that you might be able to understand. But as we get to the next layer, it starts getting to be a lot more noisy. So you stop being able to tell as clearly if there is any sort of meaningful information. This is where we're starting to come across that idea of the black box, where you can't really know what's going on. And then as we go further in, it gets really hard. There's not very much symmetry up and down or symmetry across. And then when we get to the fully connected layers, so now we've gone through all those convolutional layers and we're at this really large layer here. And when we get to that layer, we can see that it almost just looks like noise. Like there's some up and down symmetries where it kind of looks a little bit JPEG-y, but it's not, there's no real clear signals. It just looks like a really noisy JPEG. But yeah, you can't really tell very much information. And so this is where the majority of the weights are. And then after that, we go to the next layer. So the color difference between these two is actually just more of the process of image processing. But okay, so as we get to the next layer, we can see that there is a little bit more across symmetry, but it's not super clear. And then finally, in the final layer, there actually is some information here that's kind of interesting. So you can see that there's a lot of lines that kind of go across. And this is kind of interesting because it means that a lot of the signals, it is matching across. And basically this has a lot to do with how the output is structured. So if we actually look at how ImageNet is structured, there is a structure to the output. So similar things are actually put side by side. If there's a category, so this categorizes kind of animals and a lot of other things. And a lot of the similar types of animals end up getting categorized similarly. So you end up with a bunch of snakes that are along a line, or you end up with a bunch of dogs, and those all are what these lines are kind of representing. So they're representing the structure of the output and how that actually is a little bit of structured information. So for instance, if there is a line here, I don't know if there's lines across here, you can kind of see that those are probably, because they're very white, they are probably activating that neuron. And so that means that those probably mean that those are similar, those neurons fire for like a similar thing. So if those are snakes, for instance, then yeah.
So a little bit about the image processing to get from the weights to the images. So weights of a neural network are floats, and we are actually mapping those to integers through a color spectrum. So basically you're taking a span of numbers and then you're converting it into just a set between 0 and 255. So there's a lot of information lost in the sense of values that are a little bit separate will end up being mapped to similar values. You might end up with multiple values that are mapped to the same value. And then this is also amplified because some of the filters might actually have very small differences, but they might be very significant differences. And so the resolution of those might have, like, there's kind of a dynamic range thing where you're comparing a bunch of filters and kernels and you're kind of mapping those to similar. It also means that being able to recover the weights from these images, you are not going to be able to recover them perfectly. And so even though this is a representation of the network, it is a smaller representation. Another thing to keep in mind is that we are just representing the weights right now. And there are two other things that are important to consider when thinking about networks and how you can visualize them. And one of them is the intermediary step. So that's kind of, sometimes that's worded as kind of the output between layers. And then there's also the connections. So that has to do with how many connections there are between each weight and each kind of output value. And those can actually make the visualization of the network very different, because in particular, the outputs between layers actually follow a very different visual than the one that we presented. So instead of having it small near the beginning, that would make it look much larger near the beginning and smaller as you go through. And connections is even more significant, where it's very big, very large at the start, and then the connections reduce down a lot quicker. Those are a little bit harder for me to actually present because oftentimes those require an input value. And so you actually do need to do some math to get those intermediary steps and to get the connection values and stuff like that. So it's a little bit more work for me to actually present that. You need to start kind of implementing certain parts of the neural network within JavaScript, which has been done, but it's just a little bit it's a little bit more work. So the code for this one is very heavy on the Three.js side. So basically it is loading the weights as images and then transforming those into a mesh that works for that image. And so there's some manipulation involving heights, and then we include a basic material. The material will be a little bit different for the convolutional layers. So because we want there to be transparency between all the layers, because of the alpha channel and stuff, alpha channels get a little bit weird if you don't use a special fragment shader. So we're basically just using a fragment shader that throws out all the alpha colors and discards them in WebGL. That's what this fragment shader does. Once we load up all of these meshes and textures, we create the meshes, and then that's pretty much the extent of it. There's some stuff that we do with manipulating the width and height so that they are kind of separated out by distances and that they are kind of around eye level, but there isn't too much interesting things happening with the WebXR in this one. So this is available online if you want to explore AlexNet yourself. There's a little bit of an issue with, I'm going to be putting this up on GitHub, and GitHub doesn't like file sizes that are larger than 25 megabytes, which is too big for some of the images. So I might have to cut those up a little bit. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do that. Thank you and have a good day.